For 15 years, Harold Mitchell pushed his mop cart through the marble halls of Bradshaw Corporate Tower, invisible to the executives who stepped around him like he was furniture. They had no idea that the quiet man, emptying their trash cans, commanded more respect on the open road than their corner offices ever could. When a group of young hotshots decided to humiliate him in the parking garage, they were about to discover why you should never judge a book by its cover, especially when that book rides a Harley-Davidson Road King and goes by the name Iron Harold in 5 counties. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Harold Mitchell wheeled his supply cart down the 20th floor of Bradshaw Corporate Tower. At 62, his weathered hands gripped the handle with the same steady confidence that had once wrapped around motorcycle handlebars on countless midnight rides. But that was a lifetime the suits walking past him would never know about. "Excuse me," came a sharp voice from behind. Harold stepped aside as Jessica Pemberton, the marketing director, breezed past without so much as a glance. Her designer heels clicked against the polished floor, each step echoing her importance through the corridor. To her, Harold was part of the building's infrastructure, as permanent and unremarkable as the elevator or the water fountain. This was Harold's world now. 15 years of emptying wastebaskets, mopping floors, and restocking bathrooms, while executives discussed million-dollar deals just feet away from him. They spoke freely in his presence, never considering that the man with the janitor's uniform might understand their business better than they imagined. Harold had owned 3 successful auto shops before a devastating divorce, and medical bills forced him to sell everything. But pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, and honest work was honest work. The morning routine continued as it always did. Harold made his rounds through each office, his movements efficient and practiced. In the corner office, Robert Caldwell, the company's youngest VP, was shouting into his phone about quarterly projections while Harold quietly emptied his trash. Robert had never acknowledged Harold's existence, not once in 5 years of daily encounters. "The problem with this company," Robert was saying to someone on the other end, "is that we're surrounded by dead weight, people who just punch a clock and contribute nothing meaningful." Harold's hands paused for just a moment as he tied off the trash bag. Robert continued his tirade, unaware that his words had landed squarely on the man standing 3 feet away. Harold had heard variations of this speech before. In the minds of these executives, people like him were invisible, necessary for the building's function, but utterly without value as human beings. By lunch break, Harold had finished the upper floors and made his way to the parking garage. This was his sanctuary, the one place in the building where he could breathe freely. He sat on a concrete barrier, unwrapping the peanut butter sandwich he'd packed that morning, and gazed at the rows of luxury cars that cost more than he'd make in 5 years. His eyes lingered on Robert Caldwell's red Ferrari, parked diagonally across 2 spaces as if the rules didn't apply to him. Harold remembered when he could afford nice things. Not Ferrari nice, but respectable. His shops had done well, and his custom Harley had been his pride and joy. Now that bike sat covered in his small apartment's parking space, a reminder of better days. "Look at this guy," a voice echoed through the garage. Harold looked up to see 3 young executives approaching, Brad Morrison, Tyler Webb, and Kevin Lynch, all in their late 20s and fresh out of business school. They were part of the company's Young Talent Initiative, hired straight into management positions their father's connections had secured for them. Brad pointed at Harold with his coffee cup. "Every day, same spot, same sad sandwich. Don't you think it's time to aim higher in life, old man?" Harold continued chewing his sandwich, not bothering to respond. He'd learned long ago that engaging with people like this only made things worse. "I'm talking to you," Brad said, stepping closer. His cologne was expensive and overwhelming in the concrete space. "What's your plan here? Mop floors until you die?" Tyler laughed, a sound that bounced off the garage walls. "Maybe we should start a collection, help him buy a better lunch. Or maybe, Kevin added, pulling out his phone, we should document this for social media. The inspiration we need. This man proves anyone can find their level in life. Harold stood up slowly, wrapping the remainder of his sandwich. At 6'2", he still had an imposing presence, though his janitor's uniform made him appear harmless to these young predators. His grey hair was thinning, but his shoulders remained broad from decades of physical work. Both in his shops and in places these boys couldn't imagine. We're just trying to help. Brad continued, his voice dripping with false sincerity. Maybe you could apply yourself more. Learn some skills. There are community college programs for people your age. Harold's weathered face remained impassive, but something flickered behind his deep brown eyes. He'd been disrespected before, by customers who thought they knew better than a mechanic, by lawyers during his divorce who treated him like an uneducated fool, by doctors who spoke over him like he wasn't in the room. But this felt different. These weren't strangers or professionals doing their jobs. These were boys playing games with someone they viewed as powerless. Tell you what, Tyler said, warming to the performance. Why don't you wash my car while you're down here? I'll give you $20. That's probably more than you make in an hour. He tossed his keys toward Harold, who caught them reflexively. The keys were for a white BMW, parked nearby with a small dent in the rear bumper. What do you say, old-timer? Want to make some extra money? Harold looked down at the keys in his palm, then up at the three faces staring at him with amused expectation. In that moment, he made a decision that would change everything, but not in the way they expected. He smiled, not the broken smile of a defeated man, but something else entirely. Something that, if these boys had any experience with truly dangerous people, might have given them pause. Sure, Harold said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of something that hadn't been there moments before. I'll take care of your car. The three executives exchanged glances, surprised by his compliance. They'd expected more resistance, more entertainment. Instead, they got quiet agreement from a man who suddenly seemed different somehow, though they couldn't put their finger on how. Great, Brad said, his enthusiasm faltering slightly. We'll check back later to see how you did. They walked away, already moving on to their next source of amusement, leaving Harold alone with Tyler's keys and a growing sense that they'd just made a very serious mistake. Harold pocketed the keys and returned to his work. But something had shifted. For 15 years, he'd accepted his invisible status, found peace in honest labor, and buried the part of himself that once commanded respect across 5 counties. But some sleeping giants, once awakened, remember exactly who they used to be. That evening, as Harold clocked out and walked to his 10-year-old Honda Civic, he passed Tyler's BMW, still pristine, still unwashed. The keys sitting on the driver's seat where he'd left them after unlocking the car. Tomorrow would bring changes that Brad, Tyler, and Kevin couldn't possibly anticipate. Because while they saw only a broken-down janitor, Harold Mitchell was about to remind them that respect isn't about what you do for work, it's about who you are when tested. And Iron Harold was about to be tested for the first time in 15 years. Harold's apartment sat on the outskirts of Millbrook, a far cry from the gleaming corporate tower where he spent his days. The building was older, the kind of place where working people lived quietly and minded their own business. But tonight, Harold wasn't thinking about staying quiet. He stood in his small living room, staring at the framed photograph on his mantel. It showed a younger version of himself, leather jacket stretched across broader shoulders, standing next to a pristine Harley-Davidson Road King. Behind him, dozens of other bikers formed a sea of chrome and black leather. The banner above them read, Thunder Valley Rally 2008, Iron Harold's Brotherhood. His phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number, saw your car in the garage today. Maybe tomorrow we'll find something else for you to clean. Harold set the phone down and walked to his bedroom closet. Behind his work uniforms and casual clothes hung something he hadn't touched in years. Black leather, worn smooth from countless miles on the open road. He pulled the jacket free, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. The next morning arrived grey and overcast, matching Harold's mood as he entered Bradshaw Tower. But instead of going straight to the supply closet, he made an unusual stop. The building's security office was located in the basement, staffed by Marcus Rodriguez, a former military police officer who'd taken the job after retiring from the army. "Harold," Marcus looked up from his monitors. "You're here early. Need a favor, Marcus. Can you pull up the parking garage cameras from yesterday afternoon?" Marcus raised an eyebrow but didn't question it. He'd always respected Harold, recognizing something in the older man that others missed. "What time frame?" "Around 1:30, level B2, near the BMW." The footage played out exactly as Harold remembered it. 3 young executives surrounding him, their voices clear enough through the audio to capture every insult, every cruel laugh. Marcus watched in silence as the scene unfolded. "Those little—" Marcus started, but Harold held up a hand. "Just need to know it's recorded." "For safekeeping," Marcus nodded slowly. "It'll be here if you need it." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Harold's workday proceeded normally until lunch. He made his way to the parking garage, carrying his usual sandwich. But today he had company waiting. Brad Morrison leaned against a concrete pillar, scrolling through his phone, with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences. "There he is," Brad called out. "How's the car washing business going?" Harold sat down in his usual spot and unwrapped his sandwich. "Didn't wash your friend's car." Brad's expression shifted, a flash of something darker crossing his features. "Excuse me? I said I'd take care of it. Never said I'd wash it. You took the money, never took any money. You threw keys at me. I put them back." Brad's face reddened. This wasn't going according to script. He was used to Harold's quiet compliance, the predictable submission that made him such an easy target. "Listen, old man, when we give you a job to do, Harold's voice carried a new edge. "You don't give me anything. You work upstairs in climate-controlled offices while I keep this building running. You produce nothing, create nothing, contribute nothing meaningful to anyone's life." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Brad stared at Harold, processing this unexpected defiance from someone he considered beneath notice. "You know what?" Brad pulled out his phone. "Let's see how long you keep this job with that attitude." Harold finished his sandwich in silence while Brad made his call to human resources, his voice loud enough to echo through the garage. When he was finished, Brad wore the satisfied expression of someone who'd just solved an annoying problem. "There. Enjoy your unemployment, janitor." Harold stood up, dusting crumbs from his uniform. At his full height, he seemed different somehow. The same weathered face, the same grey hair, but something fundamental had changed in his posture, his presence. "You know," Harold said conversationally, "I once knew a young man like you. Rich daddy, fancy education, thought the world owed him respect he hadn't earned. He learned differently. Is that supposed to scare me?" Harold smiled, the same expression from the day before. But now Brad could see what he'd missed. The absolute absence of fear. The quiet confidence of a man who'd been truly tested. No, just a memory. Harold walked away, leaving Brad alone in the parking garage with the uncomfortable feeling that he'd just made a serious miscalculation. That evening, Harold drove his Honda Civic to a place he hadn't visited in months. Murphy's Auto Shop sat on the industrial side of town, a family-owned business that had survived 3 generations. The owner, Tom Murphy, was replacing brake pads on a pickup truck when Harold walked in. Harold Mitchell. Tom straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Haven't seen you in ages. How's the corporate world treating you? Ready to be done with it? Got a proposition for you." Tom gestured toward his office, and they settled into chairs that had seen better decades. Harold laid out his situation, the job he'd likely lost, the money he'd saved over 15 years, and what he wanted to do about it. "You're serious about this?" Tom asked when Harold finished talking. "Dead serious. Been thinking about it for years, just needed the right push." Tom nodded slowly. "Your reputation still means something around here. People remember what you built before. But it's been a long time, Harold. The game has changed. Some things don't change. Good work, fair prices, treating people with respect. That still matters. They shook hands, and Harold felt something he hadn't experienced in years. The excitement of building something worthwhile. The next morning brought a call from Human Resources, exactly as Brad had promised. Harold listened politely, as Janet from HR explained that his employment was being terminated due to attitude issues and insubordination. She sounded genuinely sorry, which told Harold that Brad had probably presented a very different version of events. "I understand," Harold said. "I'll clean out my locker today. We'll need your uniform and ID badge back, of course." Harold arrived at Bradshaw Tower one final time. But instead of his usual Honda Civic, he drove something that made every head in the parking garage turn. The 2008 Harley-Davidson Road King gleamed like it had just rolled off the showroom floor, its chrome reflecting the overhead lights like liquid mercury. The engine's rumble echoed through the concrete space, a sound that spoke of power and freedom and things these corporate drones would never understand. He parked directly across from Tyler's BMW, the contrast almost comical. Then he walked into the building, knowing that word was already spreading through the floors above. The janitor had arrived on a motorcycle worth more than most of their cars. In his basement locker, Harold changed out of his uniform for the last time. He put on jeans, boots, and the black leather jacket that fit him, like it had been waiting all these years. When he looked in the small mirror attached to his locker door, Iron Harold looked back. The elevator ride to the 20th floor felt different now, not because the building had changed, but because Harold was no longer invisible. He was choosing to be seen. The doors opened and every conversation in the vicinity stopped. Harold walked through the cubicles and offices, his boots clicking against the polished floor with the same authority Jessica Pemberton's heels had once commanded. But this was different. This was the sound of a man who'd remembered who he was supposed to be. He stopped at Brad Morrison's cubicle, where the young executive sat frozen behind his computer screen. "Came to return this," Harold said, placing his ID badge on Brad's desk. "Won't be needing it anymore." Brad stared up at him, taking in the transformation. You clean up nice, thanks." "Oh, and Brad? That young man I mentioned yesterday, the one who thought the world owed him something?" "Yeah?" Harold leaned down slightly, his voice carrying just far enough for the nearby cubicles to hear. "He learned his lesson the hard way. Hope you're smarter than he was." Harold straightened up and walked away, leaving Brad to wonder what exactly he'd gotten himself into. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, Iron Harold was riding again. The rumble of Harold's Harley faded into the distance as he left Bradshaw Tower for the last time. But the ripples of his departure had only just begun. Within an hour, the story had spread through every floor of the building. The quiet janitor who'd mopped their floors for 15 years had just walked out in full leather, riding a machine worth more than most annual salaries. Brad Morrison sat at his desk, staring at the ID badge Harold had left behind. Something gnawed at him, a feeling he couldn't shake. He pulled out his phone and started typing into the search bar, "Iron Harold Biker." The results that loaded made his blood run cold. Newspaper articles from a decade ago filled his screen. Local business owner leads charity ride for veterans. Iron Harold's annual toy drive raises $50,000 for Children's Hospital. Motorcycle club president mediates dispute between rival groups. Photo after photo showed the same man, younger, but unmistakably Harold Mitchell, surrounded by hundreds of bikers, speaking at podiums, shaking hands with mayors and police chiefs. But it was the article from 8 years ago that made Brad's hands shake. Biker club president hospitalizes 3 men who attacked elderly woman. The accompanying photo showed Harold, stone-faced and unrepentant, being led away in handcuffs. The charges were dropped when witnesses confirmed he'd acted in defense of others, but the message was clear. Iron Harold was not a man to be trifled with. "Tyler," Brad called across the cubicles. "Kevin, we need to talk." The three young executives huddled in the break room. Brad's phone passed between them as they read article after article. Tyler went pale as he realized the man who'd held his car keys was the same person who'd once led 1,000 bikers through downtown during a protest ride that shut down 3 highways. "This is bad," Kevin whispered. "This is really bad." "He's probably forgotten about us already," Tyler said, though his voice lacked conviction. "I mean, we're nobody to him now." But Harold hadn't forgotten. 20 miles away, he pulled into the parking lot of Roadhouse Billy's, a bar that catered to bikers, truckers, and anyone else who understood that respect was earned, not given. The Harley's engine ticked as it cooled, and several heads turned to watch Harold dismount. "Well, I'll be damned." The voice came from a mountain of a man named Roy Diesel Patterson, Harold's former vice president and closest friend. Diesel had arms like tree trunks and a grey beard that reached his chest. "Iron Harold rides again," they embraced like brothers. And Harold felt something he'd forgotten existed, the unconditional loyalty of people who'd bled beside him on the road. "Heard you'd gone corporate," Diesel said, leading Harold toward the bar. "Thought we'd lost you forever. 15 years of exile. Had to swallow my pride to keep food on the table. And now," Harold's smile carried the weight of accumulated grievances, "now it's time to remember who I used to be." Inside Roadhouse Billy's, the conversation stopped when Harold walked in. Bikers from 3 different clubs occupied separate sections of the bar, but they all recognized the legend. Word spread through text messages and phone calls. Iron Harold was back. Within an hour, the parking lot was full of motorcycles. Old friends emerged from retirement. Younger riders came to pay respects to a living legend, and even rival club members showed up out of curiosity. Harold held court at the bar, accepting drinks and handshakes, feeling the power of his old reputation settling around him like a comfortable coat. "So what's the plan?" asked Maria Widow Santos, president of the Desert Roses, an all-female riding club that had always maintained good relations with Harold's brotherhood. "You don't strike me as a man who just wanted to reminisce." Harold pulled out his phone and showed her Brad Morrison's LinkedIn profile. "This boy thought it would be fun to humiliate an old janitor. Turns out the old janitor has friends." Widow studied the photo, memorizing the face. "What do you need?" "Nothing violent, nothing illegal. Just want him to understand that actions have consequences." The plan that emerged from that conversation was elegant in its simplicity. Brad Morrison, Tyler Webb, and Kevin Lynch had made the mistake of picking on someone they thought was powerless. Iron Harold was about to teach them the difference between helpless and choosing not to act. The next morning, Brad arrived at Bradshaw Tower to find something that made his stomach drop. 3 motorcycles were parked in the visitor spaces near the building's entrance. Not just any motorcycles, massive touring bikes with chrome that gleamed like mirrors, their owners nowhere to be seen. Brad's hands trembled as he badged into the building. In the elevator, he tried to convince himself it was a coincidence. Lots of people rode motorcycles. It didn't mean anything, but when he reached his floor, 3 strangers in business suits were waiting by his cubicle. They were older, weathered men who wore their expensive clothes like costumes. One of them, a gray-haired man with scars on his knuckles, approached with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Brad Morrison?" "Yes, my name is Frank Castellanos. I represent certain business interests in the area. We understand you recently had some interactions with Harold Mitchell." Brad's mouth went dry. It was just a misunderstanding." "Of course it was. Harold's a reasonable man. That's why we're here to have a reasonable conversation." Frank gestured toward the conference room, and Brad found himself walking on unsteady legs. Tyler and Kevin were already inside, flanked by the other 2 suited men. Both looked like they were about to be sick. "Please sit," Frank said pleasantly. "We won't take much of your time." For the next 20 minutes, Frank spoke in the measured tones of a man accustomed to being heard. He explained Harold's history, his reputation, and the network of people who considered him family. He described in careful detail what happened to those who disrespected that family. Now, Frank concluded, Harold doesn't want any trouble. He's moved on with his life. But respect is like a bank account. You make deposits and withdrawals. You gentlemen have made some significant withdrawals from Harold's account. What do you want? Brad managed to whisper. Frank smiled and placed 3 business cards on the table. Harold's starting a new auto shop. These are his cards. We'd like you to distribute them to everyone in this building. Tell them about Harold's exceptional work, his fair prices, his commitment to customer service. That's it. That's it. Think of it as a marketing opportunity. Harold's very good at what he does. Your colleagues would benefit from his services. The 3 men stood to leave, but Frank paused at the door. Oh, and gentlemen, Harold mentioned you might want to apologize. Face to face. He'll be at Murphy's Auto on Industrial Boulevard every day this week. I'm sure he'd appreciate the gesture. After they left, the 3 young executives sat in stunned silence. Through the conference room window, they could see the motorcycles pulling out of the parking lot, their riders waving cheerfully at the building as if they'd just concluded a successful business meeting. We're going to apologize, Brad said finally. Are we? Tyler asked. Yes, we're going to apologize, and we're going to mean it, and we're going to hope that Iron Harold is as forgiving as his friends think he is. Kevin nodded shakily. When? Today, before he decides we need another visit from his marketing team. Outside, Harold's Harley led a convoy of motorcycles down the highway, the sound of their engines carrying across 5 counties like thunder. Iron Harold was officially back, and everyone who mattered knew it. But the real test would come when 3 humbled young executives walked into Murphy's auto shop, hat in hand, to face the man they'd tried to break. That meeting would determine whether Harold's return to power would be marked by mercy or something far less forgiving. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Murphy's auto shop as Brad Morrison's BMW pulled up beside 24 motorcycles. Tyler Webb sat in the passenger seat, his knuckles white as he gripped the door handle. Kevin Lynch followed in his own car, having insisted he needed an escape route if things went badly. Through the bay windows, they could see Harold working under the hood of a pickup truck, his movements precise and confident. He'd traded his corporate janitor's uniform for coveralls that bore the name Mitchell embroidered above the pocket. Even from a distance, he seemed different, not just in clothing, but in the way he carried himself, the way the other mechanics deferred to his expertise. He looks busy, Tyler said hopefully. Maybe we should come back another time. We're doing this now, Brad replied, though his voice carried no conviction. Before his friends decide we need more encouragement. They walked toward the shop entrance, passing bikers who watched them with the intense scrutiny of guard dogs evaluating potential threats. These weren't the weekend riders you might see at a suburban Starbucks. These were serious men and women whose motorcycles bore the scars of countless miles and whose faces told stories of roads that led far from civilized places. Harold looked up as they approached, a wrench still in his hand. For a moment nobody spoke. Then he set down his tools and wiped his hands on a shop rag, his expression unreadable. Gentlemen, Harold said simply. Didn't expect to see you here. Brad cleared his throat, his prepared speech suddenly feeling inadequate. We came to apologize. For what happened at the building? Which part? Harold asked. The part where you called me dead weight, or the part where you threw car keys at me like I was your personal servant? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around the shop, conversations quieted as mechanics and bikers alike tuned in to the drama unfolding in their midst. Tyler stepped forward, his face flushed with shame. All of it. We were wrong, completely wrong. We treated you with disrespect, and there's no excuse for that. Harold studied him for a long moment. You know what the difference is between respect and fear, Tyler? No, sir. Respect is what you give someone because they've earned it through their actions, their character, their contribution to the world. Fear is what you feel when you realize you've messed with someone who has the power to make your life difficult. Harold pulled up a shop stool and sat down, his movements deliberate and controlled. Which one brought you here today? The 3 young men exchanged glances, and Kevin found his voice. Both, I think. We were afraid. when we learned who you really are. But now, seeing this place, seeing how people talk about you, I think we understand what respect actually looks like. Do you? Harold's tone carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. Tell me what you see when you look around this shop. Brad looked around, really looked for the first time. The mechanics worked with the easy camaraderie of people who trusted each other completely. Customers waited in chairs that had seen better days, but they waited patiently, knowing their vehicles were in capable hands. On the walls hung photos of Harold with local politicians, police officers, military veterans, not the glad-handing photos of corporate networking, but genuine friendships forged through shared purpose. I see a community, Brad said slowly. People who actually know each other, who count on each other. That's right. And you know how you build a community like this? One interaction at a time. One person choosing to treat another human being with dignity, even when nobody's watching, even when there's no advantage in it. Harold stood and walked to a workbench where a coffee can sat filled with dollar bills and change. See this? Emergency fund for anyone who works here. Transmission goes out on someone's personal car. Family has medical bills. Kid needs money for school. We all contribute. Not because we have to, but because that's what decent people do for each other. He turned back to face the three executives. You work in a building where people make more money in a month than some folks here see in a year. How many of you have ever helped a co-worker who was struggling? How many of you even know your co-workers' names? The silence stretched uncomfortably long before Tyler answered. We don't. We compete with each other instead of helping each other. That's the difference between a job and a calling, Harold said. I spent 15 years invisible in your building, but I was never unimportant. I kept that place running, kept it clean, made sure you had a professional environment to work in. Every job has dignity, if you approach it with dignity. Maria Santos, the Desert Roses president, emerged from the shop office where she'd been watching the interaction. She approached the group, her presence adding another layer of gravity to the conversation. Harold's told us about you boys, she said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to command. Told us how you treated him like furniture, like he was beneath your notice. Brad winced. We were wrong. Completely, inexcusably wrong. Wrong is forgetting to hold a door or interrupting someone in a meeting, Maria continued. What you did was cruel. You took pleasure in making someone feel small because you thought he couldn't fight back. You're right, Kevin said, his voice barely above a whisper. There's no excuse for that. Harold held up a hand, and Maria stepped back, recognizing his right to handle this situation as he saw fit. Here's what's going to happen, Harold said. You're going to go back to that building, and you're going to think about every person who keeps that place running. The security guards, the maintenance staff, the cleaning crew, the cafeteria workers. You're going to learn their names, and you're going to treat them like human beings who matter. We will, Brad promised. Furthermore, you're going to spread the word about this shop. Not because you're afraid of consequences, but because we do good work at fair prices. You're going to recommend us to your colleagues, your friends, your family. You're going to help us build our business the same way we're going to help you rebuild your character. Harold reached into his pocket and pulled out 3 business cards, handing one to each man. These aren't just cards. They're commitments. Every time someone comes here because you recommended us, you're making a deposit in that respect account we talked about. Tyler looked down at the card in his hand. What if we mess up again? What if we fall back into old habits? Harold smiled, and for the first time it carried genuine warmth. Then you try again. That's what decent people do. They keep trying to be better than they were yesterday. Frank Castellanos appeared from behind a vintage Camaro he'd been admiring. His presence a reminder that Harold's network extended far beyond this single shop. Gentlemen, Frank nodded politely. I trust your visit has been educational. Very, Brad replied, meaning it. Excellent. Harold's a good teacher. Listen to him, and you might just become the men you have the potential to be. As the 3 executives prepared to leave, Harold called out one final time. Brad, he turned back. That Ferrari of yours. When's the last time you had the transmission serviced? Brad looked confused. I'm not sure. Why? Because if you don't take care of the things that matter, they break down when you need them most. Bring it by next week. We'll take good care of it. The offer was more than automotive advice. It was an olive branch, a chance for redemption wrapped in practical wisdom. As the two cars pulled away from Murphy's auto shop, none of the three young men spoke for several miles. They were processing something more than fear or embarrassment. They were beginning to understand the difference between having power over people and earning their respect. Behind them, the sound of motorcycle engines filled the afternoon air as Harold's community went about their business, not as a collection of individuals competing for advantage, but as a network of people who understood that real strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. The lesson was complete, but the real test would come in how they chose to live with what they'd learned. 6 months had passed since Harold Mitchell walked out of Bradshaw Corporate Tower for the last time, and the transformation that followed rippled through both worlds he now inhabited. Mitchell's Automotive had become more than just another repair shop. It had evolved into something approaching legend in 5 counties, a place where motorcycle clubs, police officers, and suburban families all brought their vehicles with equal confidence. The morning sun streamed through the bay windows as Harold supervised the installation of a new hydraulic lift, the third expansion of the shop since opening. What had started as a partnership with Tom Murphy had grown into something neither man had anticipated. Harold's reputation drew customers from hundreds of miles away, while his business acumen, honed during years of observing corporate operations, ensured that growth never came at the expense of quality. "Iron Harold," called out Danny Wrench Morrison, a young mechanic whose father had served with Harold in the Desert Roses affiliated brotherhood. "Got a call from Bradshaw Tower. Some executive wants to schedule maintenance for a whole fleet of company vehicles." Harold looked up from the engine diagnostics computer he'd been studying. Corporate fleet contracts were lucrative, but they came with complications he'd left behind for good reason. "Which executive?" "Guy named Robert Caldwell. Says he's the vice president." Harold remembered Caldwell, the corner office, the shouting phone calls about dead weight, the complete invisibility Harold had endured during 5 years of emptying his trash. He also remembered that Caldwell drove the red Ferrari that had occupied 2 parking spaces, like a monument to entitlement. "Tell him we'll consider it. Schedule a meeting for Thursday afternoon." Danny nodded and returned to his work, but Harold's mind was already elsewhere. The business had grown beyond his wildest expectations, but success brought responsibilities he hadn't fully anticipated. 3 months ago, he'd quietly established a scholarship fund for children of service workers, janitors, security guards, maintenance staff, using profits from the shop. Last month, he organized a charity ride that raised $50,000 for the local veterans hospital. The community that had embraced his return was now benefiting from his prosperity in ways that satisfied something deeper than mere revenge. But it was the smaller victories that brought him the most satisfaction. Brad Morrison, Tyler Webb, and Kevin Lynch had kept their promises in ways that exceeded even Harold's expectations. Brad arrived at the shop that Thursday morning, not in his BMW, but in a 10-year-old Honda Accord that belonged to Janet from Human Resources. Her car had broken down, and Brad had volunteered to bring it in for repairs while she used his BMW to get to work. The role reversal wasn't lost on Harold, who remembered when such consideration would have been unthinkable from the young executive. "Morning, Harold," Brad said, handing over Janet's keys. "She said the engine's been making a grinding noise for about a week. We'll take a look," Harold replied, noting how naturally Brad now greeted him by name, how their interactions had evolved from forced politeness to genuine respect. "How's the new position treating you?" 3 months earlier, Brad had been promoted to Director of Employee Relations, a role that put him in charge of workplace culture and staff satisfaction. It wasn't a position he'd sought, but one his newfound awareness of how people treated each other had naturally led him toward. Challenging, Brad admitted. Yesterday, I spent 2 hours mediating a dispute between the accounting department and the maintenance crew about overtime scheduling. Turns out nobody had ever asked the maintenance staff what hours actually worked best for them. Harold smiled as he popped Janet's hood. Imagine that. You know what the crazy part is? When we actually listened to their suggestions, we found a solution that saved the company money and made everyone happier. Revolutionary concept, right? The grinding noise was immediately apparent. A worn water pump bearing that would need replacement. Harold explained the repair to Brad in terms that respected his intelligence while acknowledging his lack of mechanical expertise, a courtesy he'd never received during his years at Bradshaw Tower. As Brad prepared to leave, Harold called out, "How's Tyler doing with the mentorship program?" "Better than any of us expected. He's matched with a kid whose mom works in our cafeteria. Kid wants to study engineering, and Tyler's been helping him with college applications. Last week, Tyler drove him to tour 3 different campuses. The mentorship program had been Tyler's idea, born from his realization that he'd never considered the families and dreams of the people who served his lunch every day. What started as penance had evolved into genuine passion as Tyler discovered the satisfaction of investing in someone else's future. And Kevin's running the Employee Appreciation Committee now. You should see the Christmas party he organized last year. Instead of some fancy catered affair, he rented the community center and hired the security guards band to play. People are still talking about it. Harold nodded, pleased but not surprised. When people learned to see others as individuals rather than functions. Compassion followed naturally. That afternoon brought Robert Caldwell's visit, and Harold found himself curious about what 15 years of observation had taught him about the man. Caldwell arrived precisely on time, driving the red Ferrari that still occupied 2 parking spaces. But his demeanor was notably different from the arrogant executive Harold remembered. "Mr. Mitchell," Caldwell extended his hand. "Thank you for considering our fleet contract. I have to admit, I was surprised when I learned that Harold Mitchell, the Iron Harold, had been working in our building all along. Most people don't look past the uniform," Harold replied neutrally. "No, they don't. I didn't." Caldwell's admission carried the weight of genuine regret. "I understand from Brad Morrison that we owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually." Harold gestured toward his office, a space that combined the practical functionality of a working garage with the professionalism of a successful business. Awards from motorcycle clubs hung beside commendations from the Chamber of Commerce, while photos of charity events shared wall space with technical certifications. "The contract," Harold said, settling behind his desk. "Tell me what you need." For the next hour, Caldwell outlined Bradshaw's fleet requirements. 37 vehicles ranging from executives' luxury cars to maintenance trucks. The contract would be substantial, enough to require hiring additional mechanics and expanding the shop again. "Why bring this to me?" Harold asked when Caldwell finished his presentation. "There are larger shops, national chains, that could handle this volume." Caldwell leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "Because reputation matters. Our employees have been talking about Mitchell's Automotive for months. Half of them already bring their personal vehicles here. They trust you, and they should. You kept our building running for 15 years while we barely acknowledged your existence. That bothers you now? It should have bothered me then." Caldwell's voice carried the frustration of a man reckoning with his own blindness. "I spent 5 years walking past you every day, treating you like part of the furniture. I made assumptions about your education, your capabilities, your worth as a human being, based on nothing more than your job title." Harold studied the executive across from him, recognizing something he hadn't expected, genuine humility. "You know," Harold said, "I used to listen to your phone calls while I emptied your trash. You were usually talking about quarterly projections, market analysis, strategic planning. You weren't wrong about most of it. You understood what I was talking about. I owned 3 successful businesses before life knocked me down. Bankruptcy, divorce, medical bills. Sometimes the world teaches you humility, whether you want to learn or not." Caldwell absorbed this revelation in silence, the implications settling over him like a weight. How many others have we missed? How many people with experience, with wisdom, with something valuable to contribute do we overlook because they don't fit our preconceptions? That's the question, isn't it? Harold leaned forward. Every person in your building, the security guards, the cleaning crew, the cafeteria staff, they all have stories, dreams, expertise in areas you've never considered. Some of them might surprise you if you took the time to listen. I want to do better. We want to do better. This contract isn't just about vehicle maintenance. It's about building a relationship with someone who represents the values we should have been practicing all along. Harold considered the offer, not just in terms of profit margins and expansion opportunities, but in terms of what it represented. Taking Bradshaw's business would mean regular interaction with a world he'd left behind, but it would also mean continuing to influence that world in positive ways. I'll take the contract, Harold said finally, but I have conditions. Name them. First, all maintenance will be scheduled through my staff, not through corporate procurement. My mechanics will deal directly with the employees who drive these vehicles, and those employees will be treated as valued customers, not just numbers on a work order. Caldwell nodded. Agreed. Second, Bradshaw pays fair wages for quality work. No haggling, no attempts to squeeze margins. We do good work. You pay what it's worth. Absolutely. Third, and this is non-negotiable, every Bradshaw employee, from the CEO to the newest janitor, gets the same level of service and respect in this shop. I don't care about corporate hierarchy once you're here. I wouldn't expect anything else, Caldwell said, and Harold believed he meant it. They shook hands on the agreement, but as Caldwell prepared to leave, Harold had one more question. That Ferrari of yours, when's the last time you had the clutch adjusted? Caldwell looked puzzled. I'm not sure. Is there a problem? Not yet, but there will be. Bring it by next week. We'll take care of it. As Caldwell's Ferrari pulled out of the parking lot, occupying only one space, Harold noted with amusement. Danny Wrench approached with a grin. Boss, you realize you just agreed to service the vehicles of everyone who used to ignore you? Harold smiled, watching the red sports car disappear into traffic. Sometimes the best revenge is forcing people to recognize your worth by becoming impossible to ignore. The sun was setting as Harold locked up the shop that evening, but instead of heading home, he walked to where his Harley waited in the parking lot. Around him, the sounds of a successful business winding down filled the air. Mechanics cleaning tools, customers driving away satisfied, the rumble of motorcycles as his biker family prepared for their evening rides. Maria Santos pulled up beside him on her custom road glide, her Desert Rose's colors gleaming in the fading light. Good day? She asked. Productive day, Harold replied, straddling his bike. Landed a big contract, helped some people understand what they'd been missing, started planning for the future. And tomorrow? Harold started his engine, the familiar rumble filling him with the satisfaction of a man who'd found his place in the world again. Not as the invisible janitor who cleaned up after others, but as Iron Harold, businessman, community leader, and living proof that respect, once lost, could be earned back through patience, wisdom, and the simple act of treating everyone as if they mattered. Tomorrow we keep building, he said, pulling on his helmet. One relationship at a time, one act of decency at a time, one person learning to see others differently at a time. As the convoy of motorcycles pulled onto the highway, their headlights cutting through the gathering darkness, Harold thought about the journey that had brought him here. 15 years of invisibility had taught him the value of every person's contribution. The pain of being overlooked had given him the compassion to ensure others never felt that same dismissal. The humiliation of being judged by appearances had shown him the importance of looking deeper. The 3 young executives who had once thrown keys at him like he was their servant now understood. Their dignity wasn't determined by job titles or salary levels. The corporation that had once treated him as disposable now sought his services and valued his expertise. The community that had watched him disappear into anonymity had welcomed back a leader who understood that true strength came from lifting others up. Iron Harold was riding again, but he was no longer the same man who had once commanded respect through reputation alone. He had become someone better, a man who had learned that the most powerful position in any community wasn't at the top looking down, but at the center, helping everyone around him rise to their full potential. The highway stretched ahead, full of possibilities, and Harold Mitchell, janitor, businessman, biker, and teacher, rode toward whatever challenges tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that respect, once earned through character rather than fear, could never be taken away again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.